Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 7th BEREC Stakeholder Forum. My name is Philippe Defreng, and along with Erszbeth Fitori, we will be moderating some of the exchanges this afternoon. When you look at the great program that was put together by the organizers, it revolves around two topics. The one that probably fills in the room this afternoon, a very good selling point, security. And then in the second part, we will discuss about the BEREC Work Programme 2020. The reason why BEREC has this stakeholder forum is to basically have an open dialogue with you. So what I really expect from you, and Erszbeth as well, is you to listen carefully, sharpen your pencil, and write down your thoughts and questions, so that when we give you the floor a bit further down the road, there are plenty of hands raised, and you contribute to make this a lively debate. So thank you in advance on behalf of the two moderators for your help. I'm now delighted to welcome on the stage the current and upcoming BEREC Chairman, Jeremy Godfrey and Dan Sjöblom. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeremy Godfrey, current BEREC Chair, and this is Dan, who's the incoming Chair for next year. We have, I think, a record number of people registered and attending the Stakeholder Forum. I don't know whether that's because of the fame of the pre-forum lunch, or whether it's I think probably more to do with the content of the forum. Last year, we had very good discussions with stakeholders at the forum about BEREC transparency and BEREC engagement, and what we can do to be more transparent and engage better with stakeholders. The Stakeholder Forum is a long-standing mechanism for doing that, but I hope that you will have found that over the course of this year, with all the work BEREC has had to do on code implementation and guidelines and so forth, that the additional opportunities we've created for stakeholders to tell us what they think about the items we're working on at an early stage has been worthwhile, and we're certainly open to hear more feedback from you about those matters. One thing that is introduced in this year's Stakeholder Forum is going to be an open mic session later in the afternoon, where Dan, I, and Michel van Benningen, who is the incoming chair for 2021. So you'll have the three of us, yesterday's man, tomorrow's man, and the day after tomorrow's man. You'll be able to ask us questions about anything to do with BEREC. And then I think after the forum is over, also I'd like to invite you to a networking reception outside. This is not Chatham House rules. This is an open public session. We're being live streamed, so hello everyone on the live stream. Please also, we're glad to have you as well. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I hope we have a really good and exciting discussion, and I'll hand over to Dan to talk a little bit more about the show. Dan.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good afternoon also from me. It's a pleasure to stand here inviting you for this year's, indeed, as Philip was saying, the 7th Stakeholder Forum that BEREC holds. It's only my third, and it's I can tell you, quite different to stand here in the capacity as incoming chair compared to previous editions, where I've been more or less sitting where you are relaxing a little bit and participating at a slightly different level from this year. So I'm very happy to be here on stage with my good friend and colleague Jeremy, who will guide us through this. He has done it on stage once before, so I'm sure we'll have a fantastic day. And as I think both Jeremy and Philip have said, this is really the opportunity for you to engage. So please use that opportunity well. We want to have a good discussion with as many of you as possible. And those who do not want to raise their questions from the floor, or if there are too many questions, please don't hesitate during coffee breaks and indeed at the reception at the end of the program. Philip said that we would have 2 parts to the session. I think actually it's 3 parts to the session. So we will start indeed with the security issue. I think it's very much risen on everyone's agenda since last year, and since, if you move back even a little bit more. It's something we talk about very much. It will start actually with no less than 4 keynote speakers. So you see there is a number of different perspectives that will come in at the beginning. And then there will be a panel discussion not involving any of the 4 keynote speakers. So you see we have to work with the program to fit all the perspectives in before we have the feedback and discussion with you all. I think overarching theme for me in terms of my NRA's perspective into security and also for BEREC is how can we become better at integrating really what we do in the field of security with all the other work we do. So feedback in both directions is something that I think we need more of, and we'll talk more about that later. And then the work program 2020, I will present that, and we'll have a discussion about what are our focus areas for the coming years. And then the last program part, which I look forward to very much, is to share the stage, as Jeremy was saying, with him and with Michel in his capacity as still sitting down comfortably on the first row. And next year, Michel, you will be standing here in the beginning of the show. So again, very much welcome, everyone, and let's get the program started.
Thank you, Dan and Jeremy. So as announced, we will move into the first part of this stakeholder forum with a session on security, and I'm delighted to welcome on stage Anthony Whelan, who doesn't need any introduction, I think, and who is delighted not to be talking about the code. So I think a warm round of applause for Anthony, who is speaking on a new topic. You know?
Thank you, Philippe, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, I'm a little bit off my normal turf of the last few years, although I should mention, because the code is always relevant, that of course the security provisions of the code will be very important in terms of the composition of the toolbox and the next steps that comes with the review of 5G security. But let me first step back a little. I think if you had said to me in, I think, around 2011, 2012, when we were negotiating in a political environment which was not entirely receptive to this, the extension of the mandate of ENISA, the European Agency for Network and Information Security, that within the same decade we would have a dedicated session, that we would have had the process that has now reached one of its milestones on 5G security, I would have been a little bit skeptical. If we are at that place, I think it is remarkable for a number of events, or for a number of reasons. One of them is the extreme importance that 5G has taken, I think, in the political conception and the economic conception of how the digital economy and society will function, the central place that it will have as the network that carries everything, of course increases its importance, and therefore the importance of cybersecurity on those networks. What is also remarkable is the degree of cooperation and common assessment that this process has, in fact, unleashed on the part not only of what I might call Brussels bubble actors, but of the security authorities in the member states as well. An interaction that was not always obvious in the past, but where really aligned interests, I think, drive a rational orientation towards cooperation. And last week's publication of the EU-wide risk assessment report building upon the Commission recommendation, which was in turn invited by the European Council earlier this year, marks, I think, a turning point in the EU's efforts to ensure a high level of cybersecurity in 5G networks. It is an achievement of the member states acting together through the NIS cooperation group, with ENISA and with the services of the Commission. It is not a purely Brussels document by any means. And if I may say as an aside, having had no personal part in drafting it, it is an analysis of a clarity and structure that is actually rare in documents written in a committee format. And I recommend it to all of you for clear writing as much as for its substantive assessment. As regards the substantive assessment, I think there are probably three key messages that I can take out of it as something of a layman myself, but which need to be at the heart of a joint approach to 5G security in Europe. The first is the identification of the technological challenge. Clearly, for the reasons I mentioned, the new capacities of 5G, which bring massive economic opportunities, and bring, by the way, also in a number of key dimensions, enhanced security to our networks relative to 3G or 4G. Those same features increase the exposure or the attack surface for vulnerabilities that can be associated, for example, with poor software development or poor patching and update processes. So our approach here, by very nature of that fact, needs to be more serious and more resource intensive. Secondly, the importance of the supply chain is something that follows rather directly from the development of the 5G market. We see a big and growing number of interdependent players, a trend that already existed but which is intensified in 5G networks and gives probably much greater practical importance in the running of networks to third-party suppliers, third parties to the network operators themselves, which of course brings a difficult, painful process of assessing one's suppliers and the assurances they can give, their origins and pressures they may be subject to, the degree of access and control they may be given to the network, and above all else, because this is simply good security hygiene in any setting, to avoid overdependence on any single supplier within a given network or in the network landscape of a given country. Thirdly, we cannot avoid the geopolitical aspect of this. We cannot ignore that if 5G networks become ever more central to the running of our economies, of our public services, and much more, then their attractiveness as a target for state or state-backed actors invites, of course, extra caution and extra efforts in order to defend, ultimately, our way of life, which will be built upon these networks. And this, of course, also depends upon environmental factors, if I might call them that, such as the adherence to the rule of law and to good cybersecurity norms in the international domain. This work is far from over. It announces a next step, which is the preparation with the same community of a toolbox of measures for member states to deploy proportionate, well-adapted tools that can be used to mitigate the threats without, of course, sapping the opportunity that 5G represents for our communities. And that is a process where we welcome, among others, the input that BEREC will be preparing with its own, of course, vital insight on the regulatory landscape in the member states and on the market conditions in which networks are to be rolled out. This process will not stop with the toolbox. Of course, there is then an important deployment stage, which of course lies first and foremost with the member states who have primary responsibility for security. But it will enter into a wider agenda of the new Commission. President-elect von der Leyen has very clearly underlined the importance she attaches to increased vigilance in the cybersecurity area. So be it in the area of certification, on working on implementing rules for network and information systems, or of rapid emergency response systems, for example, through a joint cybersecurity unit with the member states. There is clearly plenty to do, and I am looking forward to today's discussion in order to enrich that debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll try not to duplicate too much of what Anthony has already been saying, but of course this is, there's a lot of things that can be said here. We know that 5G is coming. We know that it will enable a lot of new things. There will be lots of increased connectivity all around us. Everything will be connected, data will be shared. And as we heard, we've got that document last week from the Council. The member states decided that this critical IT application needs a new toolbox of security that we can contribute to. And that's part of the difficulties. We know that a lot of things are going to be happening to our societies, to our everyday lives, that many social functions that today are not in the digital world are every day becoming a little bit more so. But we don't know exactly which ones, and there are a multitude of stakeholders and interests that are involved in the process. And it may not always be as centrally coordinated, even at national level, as one may think. Now, in BEREC, we have been looking at 5G, of course, for some time. I think I saw Jonas somewhere in the foyer before, and during his chairmanship in 2018, which is not so long ago, we looked at 5G as an enabling tool for. We wanted to enable 5G deployment as very much of a focus area. Now I think 5G is gradually being rolled out. It's arriving. What we see is that, and that's I think no news to anyone here, 5G is very much built on the existing 4G and 3G applications. And the enhanced security applications that will come with 5G technology that I think you referred to, Anthony, is not necessarily kicking in from day one because we are building on existing infrastructure. Speaking to those who are much more experts on this than I am, I hear that it's like 2 to 5 years away from today that we will have fully deployed and developed 5G network systems that can support these new security formats. And it would, of course, as a regulator, be very nice to be able to look at our different interest groups and to not promise or guarantee, but to at least say that well, the level of security that will be required for the upcoming services will be there. And we are looking at this and we are getting there. I think there are lots of effort, and this joint collaboration around the toolbox is certainly helping us very much to get in that direction. But the target is very difficult to zone in on because it's very dynamic, and that makes it very difficult. So the technology is developing, as you know, every day. The threat assessment is not necessarily stable either. It has many different components and it develops over time. And as always with regulation, we try to keep up, we do our best to keep up, but we're not necessarily always as quick as we might want to be. So those are elements that we need to be very much constantly aware of, that this challenge, meeting whatever the requirements are and hitting that target when we have even more of our lives in the networks and in the digital space is not an easy one. And there won't be, I've seen that quoted many times, there won't be a single silver bullet solution. It needs to be many things that work together. I think that's very important. We need to build baseline security in the 5G networks, and we need to address through the toolbox, through continued discussion on what is the assessment of the threat, what is the development of technology, tools that are as adequate as they can be to fulfill our target, what we should be doing. So within BEREC, what have we been doing? We created, as of this spring, a ad hoc working group because we saw that the Commission asked us to do things in that recommendation from March. What essentially we've been doing so far is a little bit focused maybe on fact-finding. We are not a very homogeneous group of regulators in BEREC when it comes to the areas outside the core competences of BEREC. Some of us have responsibilities in the security area, if you want, and some do not, and it varies quite a lot. So we have just figured out what does it look like and how can we, given our strengths and our knowledge, best support those who are even more central to this role. We've heard about the ENISA, we've heard about the NIS Cooperation Group, and ultimately the Commission and various, of course, for all of us, domestic agencies that are very much involved in these discussions as well. So it's a broad group of stakeholders that we have to interact with. It's a target that keeps moving a little bit. But we do have strengths in BEREC, and whilst we are not aiming to step forward and necessarily take over any responsibilities from anyone else, we think that there are things that we will be able to contribute and to assist with. Our knowledge of the markets, our knowledge of deploying new systems, our contacts with operators and others in the digital ecosystem. We need to work on developing those skills, and we need to offer that to those who are more centrally placed in the security discussion. Again, ENISAs, the NIS group, national certs, whoever it might be. And we need to keep working on closer relationships, better cooperation to fulfill our common targets. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. We are preparing for the spring of 2020 a workshop with stakeholders on security, so that I will come back to that a little bit later when I talk about the BEREC Work Programme. I'm very happy that we have this discussion today. I think, as you may have heard, I think this is a very important and very difficult challenge ahead of us, so we need to work together, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. No silver bullet. The next speaker will, if the God of technology are with us, will intervene via video conference from Paris. His name is Marnix Dekker, and he's the NIS Directive Coordinator at ENISA. Are you there, Marnix?
Thanks a lot. Yes, indeed. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I will try to stay brief. Sorry for not being there in person. Would have loved to interact physically, but calendars are difficult in this period. So very briefly, I wanted to give some other perspective on the 5G work that's been ongoing. At the moment, actually, I'm busy working on the 5G toolbox, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a different perspective. So here's a brief overview of the EU cybersecurity legislation, the timeline. And actually, if you remember well, the telecom sector was one of the first to have a specific legislation on cybersecurity. After that, we got IDAS and the NES directive, and now we have the Electronic Communication Code. And what is interesting is that all these pieces of legislation follow the same structure in terms of a supervision approach. So they ask the operators to do a risk assessment, to take appropriate security measures, and then to notify any incidents if something goes wrong. Now, the nice thing about this kind of cybersecurity legislation is that it specifically says that it's up to the operators to assess the risk and then determine what are the right security measures. And for this, of course, we work very closely with industry and to understand, what can be expected. So going to the start of that, which is the Article 15A, which was the first EU cybersecurity legislation specifically, just some details on that. So as I mentioned, the triangle of supervision, as you know, it's a directive, so member states set their own national requirements, and these are often very different. They have different thresholds and so on. But a lot of work, a decade of work has been ongoing between the member states on harmonizing those security requirements. So there's a framework of security, which is standards neutral. It does allow you to map to industry standards. It has a notion of maturity levels, because of course, not all the providers are the same size. Another interesting part of Article 13A is the breach reporting that we've been doing for the last 10 years. So here's what that looks like in the last 8 or 9 years. So about 160, 170 major incidents per year get reported to us by the telecom regulators. That has been quite stable. And what is interesting here, if you look at trends, the number of system failures is consistent at 2/3 of the overall, and malicious actions are actually quite small in terms of causing major outages. And what is good for you to realize, also coming back to the points of the previous speaker, is that those system failures very often involve IT equipment, and the classical clash of telecom providers against IT providers is still very much alive. And it's for telecom providers very difficult to deal with software that gets delivered in production before it's completely ready, full of bugs, hard to manage seriously. And that definitely is that is a problem also looking ahead to 5G. If you want a little bit of advertisement, there's a nice online tool at the ENISA website that you can use to do your own custom analysis of those incidents, and you can dive into those 1,000 reports to see, for example, how many DDoS attacks have taken down base stations or whatever analysis you want. Moving on, we have done some other interesting work, of course, on telecom security. Just mentioning here the SS7 interconnection protocol, which is a big issue. Published a paper a year ago together with industry. Those kind of legacy protocols will remain an issue in 5G as well. And indeed, as said already, 5G will be deployed against existing 4G core and legacy protocols. So a lot of the security issues will remain there for sure. We also did a very nice paper together with BEREC on security exceptions to the EU net neutrality rules. It was a great collaboration with BEREC, I have to say, trying to explain under what circumstances providers can proceed to block traffic to protect networks or customers. Another more technical paper on border gateway protocol. We also are about to publish a paper on security supervision under the European Electronic Communication Code. This was also done in close collaboration with BEREC. So keep your eyes out for that one. And then, of course, everyone speaks about this. There's a lot of ongoing work on 5G security within the NES Cooperation Group. And as you probably know, BEREC is part of the 5G work stream, actually representatives of the ATUC working group on 5G. So there's also quite close collaboration. I will not bore you with the NES cooperation, with the NES directive, but here's a rough overview of what the NES Cooperation Group is doing, all the activities, and all the way right at the bottom, you see the work stream on 5G cybersecurity. And ENISA is supporting all those work streams. And in most work streams, there's member states leading the process and making the final decisions and we do the groundwork, so to speak. Now, cybersecurity activities for 5G. So as you know, there's a work stream in the cooperation group. The first part has now been completed. This was the part where the member states had to make a risk assessment. This work was consolidated and put together in a single risk assessment document. And there were 10 risk scenarios that were highlighted there. I will not discuss that in detail because you can find it online. Indeed, I think it resulted in a very clear document. Now, part 2, the ENISA threat landscape. I would have liked to show you something of that already, but couldn't get approval yet from the teams involved. But it's in the final stages. This will be complementary to the national 5G risk assessments and will be much more a technical overview of technical threats. So probably more relevant for the technical experts in the sector, and in that sense complement a more high-level view from the member states. And then part 3, this is where we are now. We just started work on the toolbox. And again, would have loved to show you some things that we are discussing about in the toolbox, but this is really, really early stages. What I can tell you is that we are working on, with input from the BEREC 5G survey, the fact-finding that was mentioned earlier. It was very useful material on good practices and measures. And just then maybe let me just conclude because with some general observations on 5G in general. So first of all, I think, coming back to the silver bullet remark, it's indeed an ongoing process and it will be a long process. I mean, take one example, I think many people mentioned certification will be part of the toolbox in some way or another. Now, even if there is a certification framework, that doesn't mean, of course, that the providers can sit back and relax and assume that everything is secure. And that will not mean either that the regulators will be able to sit back and relax and assume that everything is secure. So those things are not, it's not that you take one measure and then it's fine. There are many ways to go about it. It will require collaboration from many different stakeholders over a longer period of time. And so these are more like multiple patches trying to tackle the same problem rather than a single magic bullet. And then finally, the future setup and what we're all foreseeing in terms of 5G is kind of visualized on this slide. And I think from here you can indeed already see where some of the pain points are, and definitely the ideas about deploying the core network as a cloud service, and then questions about jurisdiction and where that cloud is located and which providers are providing it. Those will be some of the more tricky questions to answer, because we all know how the cloud computing uptake has geopoliticized, so to speak, the cybersecurity discussion. And so then finally, let me conclude, with just generally, ENISA has always been very positive of new technology and new developments, and we're really looking forward to leverage the security opportunities of 5G, because as expected, it will also improve security on a wide range of matters. So we're looking forward to help everyone securely adopt 5G. And then for the rest, in terms of my personal work with telecom regulators in the Article 15A group, we're looking forward to take some of the toolbox measures and integrate them in the existing security supervision, so to speak, to bring it into the daily business of supervisory authorities in the member states. And then some of those measures will have to be implemented at EU level, like, for example, certification framework, but some things can go into the realm of telecom regulators. And then, midway 2020, I think we should have a single framework for security supervision that takes into account both the changes that were brought about by the code and the risks identified and the measures needed in the 5G work. So that's roughly the outlook from our side, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Marnix, for being with us. Thank you also for enriching our vocabulary. I noted things like threat landscape, 5G toolbox, geopoliticized. So thank you for that. I'm delighted to welcome now the last speaker for these opening remarks before we hand over. And this is Jonas Wessel, who is Director Spectrum at PTS, but also the chairman of the RSPG. Jonas.
Thank you very much, Philip. And it's all really in the role as RSPG Chair that I'm speaking today, last in this opening session. Thank you very much to BEREC, Dan and Jeremy, for inviting me here. I think it's a long-standing now tradition to visit each other's stakeholders' events, to learn from each other and actually to show that there is a close cooperation between RSPG and BEREC. I think it's important to both of us, both our organization members, but also to you as stakeholders to be a part and see that we're actually working together on this. When it comes to 5G for the RSPG, we had our last plenary for the year last week, and we actually closed our working group on 5G. That is actually to commemorate that we've been working on 5G for quite a number of years now within the RSPG. And we've said that our work is done when it comes to 5G. That has to be specified and clarified to some degree. What we've done over the course of the last couple of years is to issue a number of opinions on 5G where we have identified the bands, we have made clear the path to finally get 5G out there going. So if you look at, it has been identified by the RSPG. We're looking at 700, 3.5 and 26. I think that everyone can talk about those bands in their sleep at the moment. So we've done that. We've harmonized the bands through the Commission, through Commission decisions, through CEPT work, etc. And we also standardized all of these technologies through 3GPP, etc. So there's really one thing left. It's up to member states to award the spectrum. And that's where our paths cross again between BEREC and RSPG in the awards processes. We have quite recently, with the implementation of the code, seen the advent of Article 35. For all of you not familiar with that, it is the peer review process where we actually learn from each other and get the experts into a room to learn from how do we package and how do we award spectrum. And I think that's really where the issues come in. Just to advertise what we're doing in that joint work, we will be having a workshop on Monday, which is a joint BEREC RSPG workshop for member states on awards, just to get a bit of notion on where we're standing. And there are a number of issues where we need to talk. Our work is not done. One of them is on security measures. And of course, the RSPG, just to be very clear on that, the RSPG has not had security issues in our work program that will be ending by end of this year, and we do not foresee it in the draft new work program that actually went on public consultation by today. However, security issues is at the heart of what we do. It is important to see that we are at the start of digitalization in the world. We have a situation where we're putting all our money, friends, pictures, maps, etc. into mobile networks and other networks, of course. We're approaching a time where mobile telephony and mobile networks are not a supplement, not an add-on to fixed networks. Fixed networks are disappearing, and the physical world is actually going digital. That gives us a new need to look at security issues. Because there is no alternative, and going back is really not the way to go. We have over time said many times that spectrum is the lifeblood of these markets. We've also said that for that lifeblood to be pumped around, we need a well-functioning heart, i.e. well-functioning markets, willing to invest, willing to package and sell service to consumers. And just to lift that analogy slightly further, I think we also need a body that's working, free from infection and free from injury, i.e. the networks itself and the security level of that. And I think we might actually need to start talking about a type of biosystem. We've always talked about the ecosystems of mobile networks, where we mean manufacturers, equipment, etc. But the biosystem of the blood, the heart, and the body to be well functioning together, because that's when we build trust, where we can actually put our digital lives onto those networks. So I think it's important to see that. I think this morning's session has been quite powerful because we've seen from the Commission, from BEREC, from ENISA, and now from RSPG, 4 institutions or organizations standing up talking about network security. We didn't see that quite a number of years ago, and I think that sends a very strong message to all of us that we are taking all of these issues very seriously. So I'm looking very much forward to the next panel session where we will hear a bit from the expert and learn, because I will take much of this back to the RSPG and see how can we interact, how can we sort of package, award, and make the bloodstream work, both for the markets but also for the body. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, for these medical analogies. I'm now calling on stage Erszbeth Fitori, who is the Director General of the FTTH Council and will act as the moderator for the security panel. And perhaps I'm inviting our panelists to join her on stage.
Yes. You will introduce them. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Philippe, and special thanks to BEREC for organizing this very exciting panel discussion for today. What is really the objective of this panel discussion? You have heard from Anthony the key challenges that we are looking at, the technology challenge, the importance of the supply chain, as well as, of course, the geopolitical aspect. You've heard from Dan that BEREC is not necessarily taking a kind of a leading role in security issues. However, BEREC sees itself, I think, as a very important partner in the broader ecosystem, is quite keen to contribute, actually, to the toolbox and the next future steps with regard to security issues. So I think today is a very good opportunity, as the favorite approach of BEREC, to engage stakeholders very early as possible in the discussion, to hear very different perspectives from an expert panel, to hear regulatory perspectives, legal perspectives, economic and also academic considerations. And of course, we would very much encourage all stakeholders who have been invited, and you are very numerous, of course, today, to actually actively engage in the debate, ask questions in the Q&A session, continue the discussion over the coffee break that will follow the panel. And then, of course, we will have a very open discussion with the current and the incoming BEREC chairs later on. So with that, please allow me to introduce an expert panel that we have here today. We have Lidia Kozlowska from Flint Global, Rosa Barcelo from Squire Patton Boggs, Olav Lysne, an academic, and last but least, we have also the economic aspect from Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, ECIPE. So first, I would like to ask the panelists to perhaps just introduce their backgrounds, the way they are looking at security issues, and which perspective they are taking to these various set of challenges. I would like to first ask Lidia to speak a little bit about the topic.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. And I sincerely think that I owe explanation why I'm sitting here and dare to talk about cybersecurity of 5G networks. I was introduced as senior advisor of Flint Global. Flint is a business advisory. We actually advise at the point where businesses and governments meet, and looking at the challenges of regulatory issues that our businesses may envisage in the future. At the same time, it's based on the vast experience that our team is actually basing on the experience in working in governments, regulatory bodies, etc. And here is where I draw actually my role here in this panel, because my previous role was very close to many of you colleagues sitting in the audience. I used to be deputy regulator in Poland, and I was also representing Polish regulator for quite some years in BEREC. I was vice chair of BEREC in 2015. And mainly, I have to say that this part of my experience is the background to which I would like to refer, opening a little bit this discussion about the cybersecurity and 5G. And the context will be very much regulatory with regards to the recommendation. I would say that we basically as a team provide an art of reading, understanding recommendations in general, if it wasn't for Anthony, who quite rightly said that this particular recommendation is pretty clear in the wording. However, what I would like to raise is a couple of challenges when it comes to the implementation. And with one particular aspect to which we are getting closer and closer, and this is certification. So basically, when you think about the recommendation, there is at almost the very end a statement that basically says that once European cybersecurity certifications relevant for 5G networks are developed, member states should adopt, in compliance with union law, national technical regulations providing for mandatory certification. And it is clear, as it sounds, however, there are a couple of challenges, and I would say that they are in two particular groups. One is timing, and the other is roles and responsibilities and resources. Basically, when it comes to timing, it is already visible on the market in some of the comments that, first of all, as always, no one size fits all. And we working in BEREC, we were always aware of this fact. But basically, the start point for many of the member states when it comes to cybersecurity measures is different. And some are really worried about what is going to be the pace of development of the toolbox that is going to be the base for unified solutions across EU. And once everybody is convinced that there is no better way forward but to make sure that all this process is coherent and is transparent and is basically unified for all EU member states, there are some that are concerned that actually they have to move a little bit faster forward with regards to the implementation of the particular measures of security on their particular national grounds. So this is one of the challenges. The other one is actually to understand who is going to do what in this entire process. And mind you, when I think about it, the certification as such is not new subject to technology world in general. And at some point, discussing with somebody, I drew this sort of comparison with type approvals in metrology, for example, where basically, yes, we know that certain devices are certified in one country and then it should be recognized throughout EU. But the bodies that are dealing with all of these technical measures are different in particular countries. And also the approach is a little bit different, which doesn't make the entire process any easier. Now, imagine that we are talking about 5G networks. Imagine about how many new types of equipment and technologies we are referring to. Imagine that we are talking not only about the networks, but also services, which means that we are talking about potentially certification of end-user equipment or sensors, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this makes a certain burden, and actually the question is, how this responsibility for certification is going to be handled on particular national grounds. Is there a competence? Are there resources? Are there enough resources? Could this competence be reorganized, for example, throughout member states? And basically, how to fast address all of these questions so that the first challenge, which is the timing, can be actually well addressed.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Rosa to share her views.
Thank you, Erszbeth. So, sorry. In my work, daily work as a lawyer, we are often asked to provide advice on what is the applicable regulatory requirements on privacy and security. And so, when we discussed this panel, we thought, well, maybe there is some merit on sort of have a few words on what is the regulatory environment that we have now and how potential certification would fit and would interplay with what we have today. So my remarks come from this perspective, so from this angle. So to some extent, Marnix has already given an outline of what is in the regulatory environment today. And as he said, if one were to, let's say, pick 4 or 5 rules that today exist on obligations, security obligations. I think he mentioned already a few, but just to summarize, the first one is obviously the Article 13 of the Framework Directive that we have today, and which becomes Article 40 of the Electronic Communication Code. It imposes on electronic communication services an obligation to implement security measures that are appropriate to the risk. So we already have one, and both the framework and Electronic Communication Code and the Framework Directive allow the Commission to issue implementing measures, specifying and detailing what security measure would be. So that's something we have today. Now, you look a little bit beyond, and you see that the e-privacy directive contains a similar requirement. So electronic communication service must implement security measures. So this is the second one I mentioned. Then you look a little bit beyond, and you see the GDPR, that it also has a similar requirement to implement security measures, the first. And then we have the NIS directive applying to a certain sector, not to electronic communication services, but other essential services, that it also imposes security measures. So there are a few more, but there is all this regulatory framework imposing some sort of measure that is, I would say, goal-based, not specific, very general. So obviously, when you look at the recommendation from the Commission, and I think everybody agrees that 5G represents new risks that apply to the telecom service, but to the underpinning all other services, and that maybe what we have now is not enough, and more measures are necessary of regulatory in the nature. So I was thinking, and wanted to share with you this for just food for thought. When I imagine, and I take the last sentence that you mentioned, Lidia, about the possibility for member states, if there was a certification scheme that was created at EU level, and then member states would maybe, as part of these regulatory bots, mandate it and make it mandatory, one would, if you imagine how would this fit with what we have? What would it be? So imagine a national law requiring the mandatory certification. And this is only, I mean, looking at possibilities. So I was thinking, would this be a transposition of Article 40 of the telecom code? Maybe not, but could be. How do we see it? I am not sure, frankly. Would this be a transposition of the e-privacy security rules? Maybe, but maybe not. So to some extent, it's a little bit uncertain what this potential measure would be. And then moving forward, what if you are a telecom operator and you would use equipment and you are certified? What would be the consequences? I'm looking at, for example, in case that the telco would somehow breach security by using certified products, would it buy you some sort of presumption of conformity or a presumption that, just imagine, you are a telco, you have a breach, data has been lost, and you have used certified services. Would it mean that somehow you could benefit from a presumption? I don't know, but it would be something that it needs to be ironed out when this moves forward. So it's sort of thoughts that I was wondering if we had such rules, what will be the consequences? Another one would be, that I wanted to mention, is the role of encryption. Encryption, we see encryption very close to a security measure. Encryption is in the code now for the first time mentioned as an example of security measure. It was not mentioned before. In the proposed e-privacy regulation that is making its way in the legislative process, the Parliament has added a sort of an obligation for ECS to include end-to-end encryption, not only encryption. So there is an emphasis on encryption, and this emphasis on encryption is, on the other side, met by a fear or concerns by law enforcement that encryption could somehow preempt the work of the law enforcement authorities. So is there something that, as the standards are still being made, that it still needs to be decided how these two worlds will meet together, more security and while allowing law enforcement? So I think that I would leave it here. Maybe this might generate some ideas in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I would hand over to Olav. You have even written, I think, a book on this very interesting topic, haven't you?
Well, yes, to some extent that is true. I'll get back to that in a second. My name is Olav Lysne. I'm an academic, as was said here. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working as an advisor for the Norwegian Prime Minister and her cabinet on cybersecurity. I would like to start by discussing the reason why we're sitting here discussing 5G security, because I don't think there were any events like this when we went into 2G, 3G, or 4G. Now we're discussing it. What has happened? Well, basically, there are two things that are happening, and one of them is that it's obvious to us, that all of us, I think, that if all the expectations of 5G will be fulfilled, then we will see that the 5G networks will be the most critical infrastructure that mankind has ever seen. It will underpin all of the other critical infrastructures that we actually have. And the second reason is that it's sort of slowly dawning upon us that auditing of electronic equipment is impossible to the full. Now that is sort of a shocking statement, and I don't have the time now to go through in all detail why that is so. This is the book I wrote that goes through the technical merits of that. If you're interested, then Google Springer, which is the auditor, and Huawei, and then you'll find that book coming up on top, and you can download the PDF and start reading it instead of listening to me. Now, the reasons for that is that the two things I mentioned, very critical infrastructure, and you cannot audit equipment. This means that there is a need for rock-solid trust between those who make the equipment and those who buy and install the equipment. And that has fueled discussions on which countries to trust, right? It's fueled discussions on which companies to trust. And it has fueled or been used as arguments in trade wars that has global repercussions. Now, 5G is the arena where this fight is being fought, but the question is far bigger than only 5G. Recent global events have led to a situation where no big global company making ICT equipment will base its business model on the assumption that East and West in the world will trust each other. So we are on the brink of a situation where every big company needs to have preparations for a situation where they have to choose whether they want to sell their equipment in the East or in the West, because the same equipment cannot be sold in both places. So the big, beautiful situation we've had in the world up until now, where equipment can be designed in the United States, built components in the Far East, assembled into a product in Europe, and then sold in Australia. That huge global collaboration that has benefited all of us, well, that is now being threatened because of this. In this game, there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. This is a global problem that all of us own together. But since 5G, and in particular 5G in Europe, is the first arena where where we see shots being exchanged between the different parties in this area. I think the discussion that we do in 5G in Europe is extremely important, because I think how it plays out here will be important to how this plays out globally later on. So the discussion that I feel is very, very important to have, and that I have viewpoints on, I'll get back to that when I get the word later, I presume, is that, well, we are in a situation where there are real, tangible security concerns. There are reasons why we discuss these things, because there are real security concerns that we really do not know how to handle. There are real political forces in play that takes advantage of the discussion and try to make it into a trade war, for instance. And there are real values at stake in terms of the existing global collaboration that we currently have in development of ICT equipment. I think we need to find a path through all of those problems. It is not easy, but I think there are ways that are favorable, and I will encourage anyone who is interested in how this plays out to take part in that discussion.
Thank you very much, Olav. I would like to ask Hosuk to give his perspective.
Thank you. I come from a completely different field than BEREC usually interacts with. I'm very honored to be here. I have been an advisor to European economic diplomacy for the last decade and a half, and I'm also a former practitioner in economic diplomacy and for a European government. So it will take a slightly different approach. And with that said, maybe this is a very good time for you to check your WhatsApp messages. I want to start from the same starting point as Olav, actually, because I think we come from the same topic from two different perspectives, which is basically why has telecoms become a national security issue? And I think it comes back to the question about how we will use data in the 5G. It's not about the architecture, it's not about configuration, it's not even about countries that are supplying the 5G equipment. It's fundamentally due to the fact that we will use data differently in 2-3 years from now. In the past, we used to upload files. Files used to have economic value. Under 5G, with the use of IoT, digital manufacturing, Industry 4.0, use your favorite buzzword here, but basically it's going to move towards control. Whereas I could, in the past, have maybe a very important and valuable blueprint of a product. Now, with 5G, the networks will actually control the entire manufacturing and sales and redistribution process. So in other words, whereas we used to have, let's say, once again, schematics, you can actually copy-paste an entire business or even an army. So that's basically what we're talking about. So it's not actually the deficiencies of what we do. It's just that we have actually moved to a point where the telecom networks have not just become the critical infrastructure, it has merged with the other critical infrastructure that is necessary for strategic planning, commercial activities, but also continuity of government. And just to give you a sense, insurance business have actually put a number to this. They assess that actually Europe is losing 55 billion euros per year in cyber espionage through for commercial actors. And for those of you who may not be an economist or not a finance minister, I can tell you that most finance ministers will cut off both their arms to say 55 billion. We're talking about 300,000 jobs in Europe per year. And in 10 years, we're talking about 3 million jobs lost in terms of competitiveness due to the fact that, well, our network leaks in different directions. There are different kind of threat actors. But I would also like to come back to some of the points that have been made around security and auditing and certification. And one of the things that you come down to if you talk in the paradigm of national security is that it's not a question about testing. It's not a question about certification. Because in national security, security and trust are two fundamentally different concepts. You cannot test trust. And some people who are real realists would even argue that trust doesn't exist in that realm. There are only common shared objectives. And now, this is where I think the process of the 5G risk assessment, which is of course unprecedented in the history of Europe, in the creation of the security union, I would also like to really laud the work of the member state and the Commission in actually getting even this far in trying to understand what the risks are and also moving towards a toolbox. And we need to bear in mind that when we build a 5G toolbox, this is that trust deficit that we need to address. So I'm sure that we'll be doing excellent work in terms of authorization and certification, but you simply cannot test trust. because once the equipment is deployed, you can always update the software, you can always use extrajudicial means in order to basically change the configuration of equipment. But fundamentally, when it comes down to the trust, it cannot be trusted, so what can you do? Well, as a vendor, I would say not much. As an operator, probably much less, because it's actually not a question about trust to the vendors. And I will say this very, very clearly. Vendors are actually hostages under the government. They can only follow the laws that are actually dictated in order to steer their business. So in that sense, we are going back to the fundamental realism of national security. It's a trust question about trust between governments. And now there has been a number of approaches which may come into consideration, either diplomatic means or through legislative means unilaterally by the EU. But there are some examples that show that, well, sorry for the cliche, but there's really no silver bullet. United States and China signed a no-spy agreement. And it simply didn't work because, one, there's no enforcement, there's no verification. It's not like a nuclear disarmament where you can take a satellite picture and see where there's no missiles being deployed. There's simply no verification that the agreement is being upheld. In the same way, we have in EU already, in the Common Foreign and Security Policy package, there's something called the Cyber Diplomatic Toolbox, where we can actually impose sanctions without attribution. We don't even have to have technical evidence. But, you know, to be, with all due respect, I don't think the European foreign ministers will actually sanction my ex-wife just because she hacked my Facebook account. I would be very grateful, but I don't think that will happen. There's no proportionality. So GDPR and other legislative means have some similar kind of deficit. There's actually no cattle. There's just a sanction. So other means that has been erased, for example, like diversification, or geographic restrictions, they can limit the damage, but they don't actually solve the trust issue. They don't actually solve the risk. They will just limit the damage just in case of an incident. So my final point is that government needs to actually engage in a dialogue, and there's actually a very good example of this. I'll go back to 2012 and the Snowden incident when NSA was found with so-called pants down over the programs like PRISM, Blarney, and XKey. United States engaged with Europe and revised the Privacy Shield in order to basically transfer data between EU and the US, between commercial actors. Store Communication Acts, Cloud Act contain number of revisions that actually create safeguard for European citizens. Judicial Redress Act actually allowed United States allies, which includes all of the European countries, to actually raise civil action against United States for intelligence purposes. What I'm basically trying to tell you is that United States paid. And I cannot see a scenario going forward if there's a similar incident that a country would not have to pay in order to regain our trust. And paying does not mean discounts to the operators. Paying means building trust in their judicial system in order to make sure that we can have a continuous dialogue again. And that's basically what the trust is about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hosuk. A lot of food for thought. Perhaps I would like to explore two aspects that were mentioned by several of you. One of them is to kind of bring back let's say, the highly political aspect to a more practical or a more pragmatic approach, and to perhaps dive a bit more into the possibility or the potential in a certification process. So you've made a kind of a very bold statement, Olav. At the same time, I think we have also heard what could be the obstacles potentially. But maybe if you could just give each of you kind of a brief viewpoint. Could certification be potentially kind of a good solution? If yes, what would be the right approach in your view? And what are its kind of limitations that you don't think might be overcome? Maybe I will start with you, Lidia.
Thank you. And I will start from the last part of the question, which is the biggest, and I don't think that breakable problem in this entire process. This is the fact that whenever you speak about security, you never think of it as a one-off action, which basically means that it has to be a permanent, reiterated process, which means that basically one-off certification is not a solution either. And this comes from a variety of angles. First of all, development of technology itself. I mean, through the years of discussing, through the first sort of start of discussion of what 5G is, we've been through a very long road. And throughout the road, the 5G as we understood it 5 years ago is a different thing than 5G that we understand it today. Which basically means that we have to sort of extrapolate this entire process. And also with regard to certification, bear in mind that this world's going to be changing in a pace that's going to be even quicker, which means that the entire process of reassurance that this technology is trustworthy will have to be continued in future. So I started from the last part, but basically I believe that this is one of the most important elements to be taken into consideration in thinking about not only the one-off action and the start or kickoff of our activities, but also how it's going to be taken forward.
Thank you. Rosa, you have raised a lot of questions, but are there any kind of answers that you would suggest perhaps for your questions?
I think, in general, because certification is to some extent a heavy tool and it will need a lot of discussion, to me, what I would find it useful is to take the necessary time and not to rush it through, so that all the right answers are now spelled out and we don't lead to unintended consequences by rushing something through.
Thank you. Olav.
Well, first of all, I may sound like I don't believe in certification. That's wrong. Certification has huge merits, and it is a path that should be followed to its end. At the same time, I think we need to be aware of the limits of certification, because the surprising fact is, as I stated, that in the world of electronics, we're in the first time in a situation where we cannot fully pull a product apart and see what it does. Well, I'm a professor of technology. Give me infinite time and infinite resources and ask me to do tell you what my phone does, and I will have to say no, I cannot do that. It is actually impossible to do. And that puts us in a new situation, and that is in that realm that the entire global discussion on East, West, who to trust, who to not trust, that is where this plays out. But that does not mean that certification is without merit. We should definitely do it, because we should definitely do anything we can. And there are things that certification will give us, and we should take advantage of that.
Thank you, Hosuk.
Now, I would just maybe briefly add that I agree with that certification is basically I wouldn't even call the first step. It's basic hygiene that doesn't actually solve any problems, but let's start there. But I would see from a perspective of someone who does economic diplomacy for a living, I would say that there is another context of this, which is that, one, we may not want to create a structure of certification, especially if you're talking about mandatory certification, authorization, which will hamper our competitiveness. I mean, just because we have high standards does not necessarily mean that the rest of the world will follow. That's one. And the second, which is a more practical aspect of this, which is that most of the devices that we will see in IoT world, we will not have the processing capability or even the physical dimension to actually contain a security application. That really puts the emphasis on the networks. It's some of the things that we are developing will not be possible to actually certify. And I go back to the question about competitiveness again. Do we want to put Europe in a competitive disadvantage while we don't actually provide a real guarantee that an item is secure? That's really an open question. What does it actually self-certification provide? And the reverse question, especially in the light of the announcement that has been done by BSI yesterday on Article 109, is that Germany will now require that every vendor to sign a self-certification that they are a trustworthy actor. Let's try the other way around. Is there a simple software developer, IoT, gizmo designer, or a 5G network equipment vendor who will certify that they are not trustworthy? Is that even a question? Is there even a choice? So without a proper sanction, I'm not really sure what that actually means.
Thank you very much. I do have a lot more questions, but I'm also very conscious that, of course, this is kind of a stakeholder forum where the most important part is engagement with the stakeholders. So I would like to invite the audience to ask questions from our expert panelists. I think my co-moderator, Philippe, might be on the floor. I would like to ask each a person who's asking a question to introduce themselves and state their affiliation as well.
Is it working? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I will remain seated. Sorry. My name is Frederik de Bakker. I work for Telefonica. Yeah, thank you very much for the keynote. I think it was very interesting. I would like to come back on the point of trust that was especially underlined by Olav and Hosuk. If we would imagine a world where every region of the world does not use other equipment providers than from his own region for his network, actually that would mean that you don't need to trust the others anymore because you don't use them. So my question would be, and hypothesis eventually, would be then, wouldn't it then be better to try to continue what we do until now? So we use equipment from other regions in the world, which in one way or another, if I understood beyond your points, would oblige the governments of the different regions to assure that trust remains between the regions so that the providers from their own countries will in the future also be able to trade with the rest of the world. So keeping the situation from the open trade, so to say, between the regions is a way to enforce or to put pressure on different governments to invest in the trust, which, as Hosuk said, would mean, for instance, that they invest in their own judicial system and so on and so on.
Olav?
Me first. I think, well, that's a very interesting thought, and it sort of relates to in a world where there is not necessarily a lot of trust, then there can be a balance in the sense that, okay, if you have my equipment and I have yours, then we can, in a sense, retaliate. This discussion is large, but there are several problems that in finding a path to get there. One of them is that at the moment it is hard to take a piece of equipment and say, where is this from? Well, there is IP, intellectual property from the States, of course. There is our components that have been built in the East, in China, in Taiwan. There is intellectual property there that is European, so where is it actually from? That is one thing. In relation to 5G, it's a difficulty in that 5G equipment is made in 3 countries in the world: Sweden, Finland, and China. It's a discussion whether things are being built in other Eastern countries as well. Meaning that most countries in the world, even most regions in the world, are in a situation where, well, we cannot build this. We have to buy it from someone. So the question inevitably comes, okay, what should I do then? I represent a very small company. I come from Norway, right? The question we have to ask ourselves is that we cannot build this ourselves. We need to buy it from abroad. How do we handle that situation? And my answer to that question is, and has, until I learn something else, I'm an academic, right? is that, well, we have to put ourselves in a situation where we are prepared for the possible future situation that we see that, well, there wasn't a provider there that it turned out that we could not trust. Then we need to our infrastructure needs to be such that we can take a look at it and see that, okay, we cannot trust those pieces, but we still have something that we can use. It's not easy to do that, but that, I believe, is a way forward that is not too destructive on the economic side of this, and still gives small nations a way to handle it. Anybody else?
Well, I'll jump in. And first of all, I share Mr. Becker's premise. I'm a multilateralist. I negotiated actually one of the agreements that you mentioned that actually allow us to export the electronic equipment duty-free. So part of the blame is on me, or actually the credit, depending on what side of the politics you are. But I will say the following, and I will quote actually one of my favorite thinkers in international relations, which is actually a Chinese professor who teaches at the PLA Academy, a military scholar. And he said something very clever when it comes to West-East relationship, which is that you don't need trust to work together as long as you share objectives. And here's where we have fundamentally different objectives. We need to bear in mind that if you're looking at that segment of the market that Olav was talking about, the countries that actually produce the network equipment have fundamentally different strategic size, economic development, and most of all, different incentives. If you're looking at cyber tools, they are fundamentally an asymmetrical tool for rising powers. And that is something that you can't really take off the table. This is a part of geopolitics. And now, what's the alternative of sharing objectives? It's mutually assured destruction. And that actually worked out, I'm not going to say well, but this is what we have between United States and China. US companies cannot fully own cloud businesses in US. Most US websites are blocked by the so-called Golden Shield. And vice versa, Chinese companies cannot invest in the United States. The difference is Europe. That's where I say we have fundamentally different objectives and interests vis-à-vis each other. I'm not really sure how this equation will play out.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? There is a question here. Yeah. Yes, could we have the mic, please, turned on?
Came back. This one is okay.
Thank you. That's good for my voice. Jacques Husebrandau, I'm from SGS, world leading testing and certification company. We do not certify trust, but we generate trust between two parties, between the buyer and the purchasing department since 140 years. And this is based on standards which both parties define, and this is the objective which you mentioned. So you define the standard, the objective, both understand and appreciate, and then a third party is going to test and verify whether it's implemented and followed. So this is from a generic point of view of testing, verification, certification. From an international point of view, we see different areas, different segments where we make use of, for example, in banking. We all use credit cards and banking cards since years. Everybody has those in his wallet. And those are all certified and even not governmental regulated. They do it by themselves because they want to have a worldwide business running, and the business continuity is of highest importance in this business as well. So my question is here, In Europe, we recently created the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework as part of the European Cybersecurity Act. And of course, we are now focusing on all the IoT connected devices and services and processes behind, and also organizations. And what we do not see at the moment is the link between the European Cybersecurity Certification Framework, which we need to fill, of course, with certain certification schemes based on different risk assessments and appropriate risks, of course. And this being mapped into the telecommunication world, into the 5G networks, equipments, services, and so on. And this is something I would like to see, to discuss how this could be prepared, and what stakeholders would you like to have at the table to discuss those standards?
Thank you. I don't know, Lidia or Rosa, would you like to pick up the question?
Well, in my view, this question actually goes back to some of the issues I mentioned here, that how to anchor this framework into the existing legislation and how it would apply. And I don't have an answer. What I have is the same question that you are very similar. So, and yeah, what would be, very practically, what would be the effects for a telco that uses this type of certificate? Does it buy, what will it buy you in terms of liability in case there is something wrong? I think are questions that need to be answered.
Lidia?
Just a short one. Basically, we tend to think about certification of networks or devices. Whilst we emphasize over and over again that with 5G, it's mostly about services. And when we are talking about IoT, sensors, etc., it is not just a pill that you stick to whatever object. There is a function that is attached to this pill, and actually that reverses a little bit the discussion about what should be tested and what should be certified.
Just one point. I must admit that I don't understand your analogy on credit cards, because financial services are heavily regulated nationally as well as by international standards. And unlike equipment, which is once tested and then deployed and never looked at again, and there's intelligence agencies in Europe has at least told me that when they actually call back some of the equipment back to see if they can reach binary equivalence between the tested software and the used software, they couldn't reach that in not a single percentage of the cases. So the way that the equipment is used is highly relevant, but unsupervised. Operators sometimes don't even know what's happening in their own networks. And because that's the business model that we are moving towards, we manage services and forth. Whereas credit cards, if you actually use credit card for money laundering, you go to jail. There is law enforcement heavily involved in the transaction and screening of every financial transaction, not just in the issuing of the credit card, but also the usage of the credit card. And that's where I think your analogy is slightly flawed. And just to add a final point, there are bankers who have gone to jail. There's not a single operator CEO who has gone to jail.
Yes, more question. Marianne from BEREC.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Marianne Fernandez. I work at BEREC, the European Consumer Organization. So I'm obviously going to ask a question about consumers. So how do you ensure consumers' right to security? So cybersecurity obviously is, but not only a matter of state and commercial interest, and there's a clear consumer angle that needs to be achieved and delivered. And in this sense, voluntary certification mechanisms would not do the trick or would not be enough. Could EU law embed security by design and by default to protect consumers?
Would like to take that question? Any of the speakers?
Well, I feel like I answered the question already, so I'll pass.
Well, I can do some reflections. I'm not sure whether I'll hit the bullseye with this, but the worries that the two of us mainly have been speaking about is mainly a worry of a nation state. I would not worry that much by being a consumer, because large nation states, foreign intelligence of big nation states will target other things than the individual consumer. That is at least my guess. Regarding consumers, I'm far more optimistic. Security for consumers, I'm far more optimistic as to whether certification and auditing can actually help us. The main difference being that the situation that we are in now, that is very new from what we've seen previously, is that we do not is that while we previously were afraid of a third party, we had a customer we had the critical infrastructure buying equipment, and we sort of assumed that the owner of the equipment and the buyer of the equipment, seller of the equipment and the buyer of the equipment collaborated against a third-party intruder. That will typically be the situation for the consumer. That is what you will be afraid of. For a nation state, the situation is somewhat different. What we fear now is that the second party, those making the equipment, deliberately put in malicious functionality into it.
Or unknowingly.
Or unknowingly, deliberately or unknowingly puts functionality into it that you do not want to have there. That sort of changes the ball game, because it places the entire cybersecurity business checkmate, because that is not the scenario that they have been looking at.
Thank you. I think there is time for a last question from the audience. And I would just also like to highlight that our colleague from ENISA is still on the line, so actually you can also ask him a question. Yes.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Sophie Batas. I'm working for Huawei. And I would like to make a few comments. I think when we talk about certification, we think it's actually a great instrument. It doesn't solve the entire cybersecurity issue, because it's a very complex problem. The problem is not only on the vendor, the responsibility is not only on the operator, the risks are not only coming from the future applications and vertical sectors critical that will connect to the telco network, making the whole 5G so critical. But I would like to highlight, there are things I'm thinking, certification one thing, then we say software updates can be pushed to network without being, and that's a risk, for the, let's say, use of the product. We don't talk enough, I think, about the cooperation the vendor has with the operators and the very strict guidelines we operate in. This is not something that maybe is public in the public domain. But for instance, talking about Huawei, we don't access the network without authorization from the operator. This update is strictly monitored through various secured environment like Citrix. So it's not, left without supervision. So I hope when we will see the toolbox from ENISA, that all the, as you described, Mrs. Barcelo, all the instruments we already have today at our disposal will be used, and the approach will be encompassing not only stronger security requirement, secure operations, certification, and also negotiations on international level to continue to build that trust that is for us highly required to continue to operate. Thank you.
And Marnix is still with us, Erszbeth.
Thank you.
Yes, I am. I'm listening with interest to the debate. It was great to hear. Repeat again. Of course, certification is not going to be a silver bullet. I don't think it's surprising that telecoms are considered critical a national security issue. Without I don't want to sound hostile, but I mean, I don't think anyone would run even a taxi service like Uber in an unfriendly nation, so to speak. So how can I say this? When computers were just standalone boxes on your desk, and you could more or less inspect what they were doing, and then of course there was no geopolitics involved. But nowadays everything is cloud connected, and you've seen the discussion about Kaspersky. It used to be an antivirus that you could buy on a CD, and then you would put a CD in your computer, you would install it, and it would do something on your PC. And you could actually test that it would do the same thing on every PC. So you could have some trust in that antivirus solution. But nowadays, antivirus solutions all have connections to the cloud. So then part of your data goes to the cloud to be checked. So then you have to start thinking about geopolitics. And so this is why suddenly with 4G to 5G, we have this discussion about geopolitics. And I don't think that is going away. And in terms of certification, and it's really good that we try to harmonize, but I do think that that telecom security will remain largely a national security prerogative of the member states. And so I can't reveal much about the toolbox, but I will tell you this, the first discussions are saying this is not going to be a mandatory list of things that all the member states will be doing. And that was also the setup of the EU cybersecurity certification framework. And I don't want to bash certification, it does play a role. But I don't think that anyone is expecting that this will be made mandatory in all countries. So I think some countries will say, yes, this is top concern for us. We will want those rules in place. We want a good mix of suppliers. We want to, like Olav said, was a great example. We want to be able to have some kind of fallback solution, maybe just for 112, maybe just for emergency services or something running, and we can go to another vendor. And some countries will say, like, look, no, we are, we're poor. We need the economic development. We need innovation. We cannot wait now. Let's get 5G as quick as possible, and we have lighter requirements. I mean, that's the reality of Europe, and that has been a decade of telecom security in Europe. And I think that is also a good situation, to be honest, that there's different countries that can take a different approach, to be honest, and take a different tool out of the toolbox.
Thank you very much, Marnix. I would also like to thank the excellent panelists in the traditional way.